Hey, it's Brandon Willie here from thirstgym.com with another episode of Thirst Training Talk, and we're going to continue our talk today on more programming models. This one specifically, undulating periodization, or what's also kind of known as non-linear periodization. In my previous videos, I've discussed linear periodization as well as block periodization. I'll leave a link to those in the description below so that you can easily find them and see how there might be similarities and differences with this programming style. Now, I will tell you that undulating periodization is probably one of the more advanced programming styles that is out there. I think it's great. It has plenty of pros, but it also has some cons as well. So today what we're going to do is we're going to break it down in real simple to easy understand terms so you can immediately take this and use this if you want to, or look at other programming methods and compare and contrast them, or if you're running a program, see if there's undulating principles in your own training program. So I've got my notes here. This is what I use with my interns when I work with undergraduate students to discuss these programming styles. I will tell you right now, talking about undulating periodization, probably not discussed at the university level, and if it is very briefly discussed and usually not put into action. So I like undulating periodization. I use it to an extent with my athletes and my clients, and I will explain how I use that. I use a little bit of all these programming styles to some degree, as most people probably do, but generally you're gonna drift towards one or the other. So for undulating periodization, just like it says, it's non-linear. So I don't like that term to some degree because all training has some linear principles in it, which I discussed in the linear programming discussion. But what I don't like about that word is that it can be misleading. So we want our training to be linear, but in general, when we're looking at it, we're not thinking about just continuing to ramp up our weights. So the main thing to understand about this programming model is that you're going to have constantly changing stimulus throughout training cycles, okay? So you could see heavy stuff, you could see light stuff, you could see moderate stuff, you could see high workload, you could see low workload, you could see very high intensities to very low intensities. It's really going to depend, one, on your coach and kind of what they believe, but also what kind of adaptation you're trying to get in the future and balancing recovery within this model. So intensity, volume, exercises, and even frequency can all be manipulated in this model, which I think is important. And it can also be trained and manipulated within a training cycle or a microcycle. So very, very simply put, to me and for most people, a microcycle is a week. Just because of the way the calendar works, 7 days works well. Now, you can make your microcycle 10 days, you can make it 5 days. I've seen people run off an 8-day model just to be able to get more through, and I've done that myself with some of my hypertrophy stuff that I've done for my own training, just because I knew I couldn't get in the gym 4 days a week. Ironically enough, I'm in the gym, but I couldn't dedicate good 4 hard days of training. So I took a 4-day model and flipped it on its head and basically did 3 of those days, and that 4th day would come at a later day. So basically I was training every other day for an 8-day span, which so some weeks I did get 4, some days I only got 3. Something to think about. That would be an undulating approach of how I'm looking at that microcycle. Now, it also means that you could change those principles, intensity, volume, the exercises, and frequency. Those can all change with anywhere from even having, let's say, a heavy week, a light week, a heavy day, a light day, a moderate week, a heavy month, a light month. That's all undulating to some extent, okay? So there's almost undulating inside of undulating depending on how big and macro you want to look to how micro you want to look. So in general, I'm going to talk more about weeks than anything else because I think that's going to be more relatable to 90% of you, but understand that your coach may be looking from a macro level to figure out and you're only seeing the micro level. So understand that. Some brief definitions I want to go over really quickly though. From intensity, I'm not talking about how hard you train, I'm talking about the intensity of the loads that you're using. So we're talking about percentage of 1 rep max, just so you understand that. So a high intensity day would be something I personally consider 90% plus or higher. That's generally pretty stressful towards the body. That'd be a high intensity day. You should be training intensely with intent all the time. So that's why I want to make sure that that's described very clearly. Volume. So this could be very coach dependent. To me, I look at training volume with everything, accessory works and main works. I know some coaches like to only look at the volume of work for the main exercise. If you're powerlifting, that'd be your squat, your bench press, and your deadlift variations, and they're not looking so much at your accessory. And there's other people that look at everything as a whole. It really kind of depends upon your coach. Me personally, I think you need to look at the whole training volume picture, because it is stress and you do have to adapt to it, right? So, but understand that volume of work is sets and reps and generally the load. However, because it's so hard to track all that with all the different variations of exercises, yada yada, usually I'm looking at volume. I'm looking at basically the amount of working repetitions that get done in the training cycle, okay? Usually the more repetitions you do, the higher your volume is, because your intensity is gonna have to be lower. You can't do 100 reps at 95%. There's just no freaking way. It's not gonna happen. So therefore, if I know I'm doing 100 total reps, my intensity had to be somewhere to the low to moderate range, so to speak, on a particular exercise, right? If, let's say for example, 5 sets 20, that's a pretty high volume, okay? So the next would be exercises. Obviously, you can choose this, whether it be only 3 exercises for the day, 5, you can adjust those as well, and those can undulate depending upon, again, those other things, intensity and volume. Usually those kind of start to fill themselves out once you've done the intensity and the volume. You're thinking about those. Your exercises don't fill themselves, but you know, if you've got a lot of high intensity work, your exercises are usually going to be on the lower end, just for the sheer fact that you don't want the training session to take 4 hours. And then frequency, how many days a week are you going to train? And on top of that, how frequently are you going to touch a certain movement pattern? So that's how I would look at all this. That's a lot to digest, right? So this is very big in powerlifting right now, more of an undulating approach. It's very good for specific movement patterns or things you want to work on. Undulating for sports, usually you're going to be fluctuating this more, especially around the seasonality time, when you're looking at working around competitions and things like that, then you're gonna have to undulate your training, because you might have a pretty high week in terms of competitions, and then you have a pretty low week in competitions. This week that I'm filming this is a great example. Generally, athletes are taking finals. Things are stressful outside the court. I'm thinking of basketball right now, primarily. Men's basketball, women's basketball. They've got practice and stuff, but not very many games because they can't, because of sanctions. So from a training perspective, I know if my athletes are not having a whole lot of practices and they're not having a whole lot of games, this might be a good week in the weight room to pick up the intensity just a little bit, because I know I'm not going to affect their play on the court. So again, this model works well for that time of year or that particular sporting group if we're looking at it from a sports perspective. So what are the pros of undulating periodization? And we'll go over the cons as well, and then we kind of talk about looking at some of the nuances as I got a little more time here. So the pros, again, great for advanced trainees, because you're getting a variety of stimuluses multiple times a week, but again, it's more fluctuating towards the athlete demands, and we're trying to stimulate the body to adapt towards high, low, and medium stress variables here. So you can get different stimuli within different training cycles as well. It can also prevent burnout and overtraining, because again, you're not having to go heavy all the time, and you're gonna have a variety of stimulus. So one day can be a light day, one day can be a heavy day, and that can help you stay more mentally prepared, knowing that not every day has got to be a 100% awesome day of training. It could be a day where you get in, get some blood flow going, because it's a light recovery day, and for many athletes that can be a great thing. So when they come back towards that heavier or higher intensity day, then you know that they can turn it on, because we've built in almost a recovery based day or a lower stim day. Then this can also be great for longer sports seasons with multiple peaks or games. I kind of just discussed that in terms of the basketball season. Great, because you can fluctuate your training more around the competition needs, which is great. We got to think about athletes. We got to think their demands is to be good at their sport, not in the weight room. The weight room is designed to aid them. So thinking about how this can help them do that, I think undulating periodization is great for many collegiate and even high school athletes, so long as they got some training time under their belt. Now, the cons, planning can definitely be tremendously harder to think about long term, right? If we're thinking about sports, for sure, all these different games and practices and whatever, we've got to really think about when can we push them, when do we got to pull back, and that definitely is going to take more planning on your end as a coach. You're going to need multiple calendars. You're going to have to look at different things, see how the athletes have responded in the past to big high-stress games, thinking about travel. So we're talking about college coaches traveling across the country or whatever in a plane or on a bus. That's all going to affect your recovery. So you got to think about how your programming is going to look a little bit differently with a model like this, because it is going to get its head flipped around a lot more than you think it would. The next one would be, there's so many variables that it can be difficult to track what's working and what's not. I mean, we just talked about intensity, volume, exercise, and frequency. That's all important for all training, but because everything is undulating, whether you're using higher intensity, lower intensity, how many sessions a week, all these different variables come in, then it can be difficult to figure out what worked well this last time I did this. Was it because I had more lower stem days, I had more higher stem days, I peaked, I started peaking 3 weeks out versus peaking 2 weeks out. There's a lot of variables there, and it's very hard to duplicate from one training cycle to the next if you find something that works, because who knows why you might have made those decisions, because it could have been a life thing, you could have been sick, anything like that. Those are all crazy variables, and like I said, very hard to track. So it's kind of one of those things where you got to be ready to pivot a little bit more throughout the training cycle, especially with an experienced coach that can help you make those pivots as needed. The last one would be that changing your variables too frequently could lead to decreased adaptation and progress. So what I mean by that is, by having all these low and high stem days, you could begin to lose some adaptation to certain things, right? So if you're mixing up, I'm trying to think of a good example here. Let's say, for example, you're working on, we'll take a power lift, you're working on your squat, and what you're finding is that you need to touch a heavy barbell 3 times a week on your squat to make progress right now. Whatever that is. We'll just say 3 heavy days, and we'll say heavier than 85%. You got to get heavier than 85% 3 times a week for your squat to actually notice like it's making progress. Well, now we got to look at, but how does that affect my deadlift and my bench press programming, right? I may only be able to deadlift heavy once a week. Every other week, I've been in that boat, and I've used that a lot with people. Deadlift over 90% every other week. And then you've got to think about the bench press, where, well, how am I going to fit the bench press into this as well and keep it from stagnating? So now you've got to start to think about, you're chasing an adaptation for a particular exercise, but what about the other 2 exercises that still need to be strong for you to be a good powerlifter, right? We're talking about sports, same thing. I get athletes a lot of times 1 time a week. I only work with them 1 time a week in season. I'm going to be very picky and choosy about what I'm taking. So if they're an athlete that, usually like basketball, for example, I'll usually choose to box squat them over deadlift or anything else. So when we come back to the deadlift after season, I have to understand that the adaptation to deadlift has been gone for a month or 2. And I was trying to make smart decisions on a recovery piece. So when I implement that deadlift back into the training program in the off season, I understand they're not going to be where they were pre-season. We went that 2-3 months without deadlifting. So like, oh my gosh, you don't deadlift. You'd be hard pressed to believe. We've got to get certain things in, and I've got to make sure that they're able to recover and good to go for their training day. I'm probably going to pick a box squat in a moderate loading scheme, just because my athletes can recover from it better than they can from the heavy deadlifts. Okay, so that's just how I'm thinking about this, but understand that that is a reality of something that happens in training programs. You got to think about that and how you're undulating your training. So that's the basics of the pros and the cons. Now we're going to talk about what does it look like in a real world model. So for me personally, when I do this with athletes, we'll talk with powerlifters first. What I choose to undulate is I choose to undulate the supplemental work, and then I also get undulating from the accessory work. So I push kind of in waves and pull back, and I undulate that way. But then I also undulate into the fact that I only have my athletes, my powerlifters, usually only deadlift heavy every other week. So that's how I'm picking and choosing. So I basically have a light week and a heavy week, a light week and a heavy week, light week and a heavy week. And so I undulate that. And then what I do then is I have my bench press and my squat undulate in 2-week phases with different exercises. And then this is using a conjugate model, which I'll discuss later in a separate video. And then I can build those up over time, and then I pull back occasionally as well when I can tell that the stress is starting to get too much, we're pushing too hard. I'll start giving them light weeks. I'll either pull out the heavy squats, I'll either pull out the heavy deadlifts, I'll pull out the heavy bench press. That's one way to do it in a conjugate-based model. The other one would be to undulate things within a week, which you'll see a lot again with the USAPL heavy guys. You'll notice that they may have 4 training sessions of the day, and they're gonna squat 2 days a week, they're gonna bench press 3 days a week, and they're gonna deadlift twice a week. So clearly you can't do all those heavy every single time, right? There's just no way to recover from it. So what you do is you pair things together. You might have a heavy squat and a moderate bench press. The next day, you might have a heavy bench press and a light deadlift. And the next day you have a moderate squat and then a heavy bench press, and then you have a heavy deadlift and some accessory work, okay? That would be a very simple model to follow if you happen to want to implement something like that. That's usually where my template starts, okay? We know that the bench press can be recovered from usually better than the other 2 lifts because you can't lift as much with your upper body, so the loads you're gonna use are less, so you can get more frequency, easier to do. Squat, usually again, people for whatever reason recover from squat a little better than deadlift. I don't know if there's any science truly behind this to really prove it, but usually you can tell, and I think some of this is because the deadlift is on the floor, it starts with a concentric exercise, and that has more nervous system demand to get the weight going. There's no eccentric lowering phase where you're relying on tissue to help you out of the bottom like on a squat or bench press. So usually lifters can adapt to the squat a little bit better as well, and then the deadlift kind of falls last. So that's usually how I look at things. I look at the squat and the bench press and then build the deadlift around it. And then you can undulate your weeks after that as well to where you're having a heavy week, a light week, moderate week, light week, heavy week, something like that, to where you might push some more singles on those really heavy weeks. And the moderate weeks, you might push 3s to 5s, and on the light weeks, you're pushing more 6s and 8s, so to speak. Or if you can think of it this way, you can start implementing RPE, and a light week is you're still doing singles, but in essence, a light week, we're only gonna have an RP of 7. So I'm still gonna take a single, but that's a light week compared to if I had it at an RP 9 or an RP 10, okay? So that's how undulating periodization works in a nutshell. Very complicated, lots of moving pieces like I just discussed. And I think you'll find that most programming structures involve some piece of undulating periodization, or they should, as well as some pieces of block. Undulating and block usually work very well together. For certain blocks, you can work on certain particular qualities, and then you can use undulating within that training block, so to speak, and then that can give you some progress. So that's the undulating periodization. I know it's very complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces here. So please feel free to leave a question in the comment section below. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions specifically on undulating periodization and maybe give you more examples if I didn't give something that resonated with you. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. Thanks. Have a great day.